magic in me. Every time I touch that track, it turns into gold. Everybody knows I got the magic in me. When I hit the floor, the girls come snapping at me. Now everybody wants the best of magic.
Every second of your life, you are under attack. Billions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi are trying to make you their home. So that you need a super complex lethal army of gods and soldiers armed with weapons of intelligence and communication weapons in order to protect you from diseases or, in worst cases, dying. In this video, we will talk about immunity responses, which is divided into two types: the innate immunity responses and adaptive immunity responses. The main difference between the two immunity responses is that innate immunity response is a non-specific one, while the adaptive immunity response is a specific one, meaning the innate immune response acts several few hours after a pathogen has been detected to be present in the body, while adaptive immunity response is composed of several complex cells, that highly specialized cells that protect the body against pathogens. Today, we will focus on adaptive immunity response, which is further divided into two types. These are the cell-mediated immunity response and the antibody-mediated immunity response, also known as the humoral immunity response. So, are you ready to learn? And if so, let's get it started.
Cell-mediated immunity is an immunity response that does not involve antibodies, but rather involves the activation of phagocytes, antigen-specific T lymphocytes, and the release of various cytokines in response to an antigen. The process begins when a macrophage, a phagocytic white blood cell that patrols tissue fluids, encounters a pathogen in the bloodstream. The macrophage engulfs the pathogen using endocytosis, the process of taking enough matter by a living cell into an endocytic vesicle. After the pathogen has been introduced into the endocytic vesicle, it breaks down the pathogen into fragments using the power of enzymes. Next, the MHC proteins bind to the antigen fragments and then transport them to the surface of the cell. The cell now displays these fragments on the surface and is now called as the antigen-presenting cell. Next, a helper T cell with the corresponding surface protein will bind to the antigen-presenting cell. The antigen-presenting cell releases cytokines called interleukin-1, which stimulates the T cell to release interleukin-2. In some reference, this interleukin is called cytokines. Since the interleukin-1 stimulates the release of the interleukin-2, the interleukin-2 would then signals the cytotoxic or killer T cell to bind to an antigen-presenting cell. The binding of the killer T cell to the antigen-presenting cell results in killer T cell destroying the antigen-presenting cell. Antibody-mediated immunity response. This is an aspect of immunity that is mediated by macromolecules found in extracellular fluids such as secreted antibodies, complement proteins, and certain antimicrobial peptides. This immunity response is also called humoral immunity response. Humoral is an adjective relating to body fluids. The humoral immunity response begins similar with the cell-mediated immune response. A pathogen enters a bloodstream and the macrophage that encounters it engulfs it through endocytosis in the endocytic vesicle where it is digested using enzymes. The MHC proteins bind to the antigen fragments and transfer them to the surface. The cell then displays the antigen on the surface and is now called as the antigen-presenting cells. Now, we can see that the fragments are displayed on the surface. Next, the corresponding T cell bind to the antigen fragments on the surface of the presenting cell. The macrophage releases cytokines or interleukin-1 to stimulate the T cell. The T cell would then release cytokines, also known as the interleukin-2. Interleukin-2 stimulated the division of T cells into multiple clumps. The second stage of this response begins when the B cell encounters a pathogen. The B cell will engulf the pathogen and breaks it into fragments. Then, it will present the fragments at the surface. Then, the corresponding T cell will bind to the corresponding antigen-presenting cell. The T cell releases cytokines. It then stimulates the B cell to duplicate and differentiate into plasma cells. These plasma cells are antibody factories that release antibodies to the bloodstream. These antigens will then bind to the pathogen in the bloodstream and mark them to be destroyed.
And those are the immunity responses which protects us from pathogens that can harm our body. Most commonly, these pathogens can enter our body through foods. So, before eating any type of food, be sure that these foods are clean, safe, and are free from pathogens so that the pathogens can never destroy you.
Any verse, I hypnotize you in every line. I'll need a volunteer. How about you? With the
I got the magic in me. Every time I talk, subtract, it turns into gold.